Now, Camilla, we've not had 3 days together, and I was wondering whether there'd be a war declared before we got back into the studio together. So thank goodness we're both safe, we're all still here, and no one's pressed a red button anywhere near a nuclear bomb. But really interested in your take, because we've not actually managed to catch up since the Oval Office complete battle between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky. And then, as you say, Starmer suddenly, is he a man reborn? Alistair Heath, one of our finest columnists, a man who has taken the battle to Keir Starmer for month after month after month, saying that this man is going to lead us into some socialist hellscape, writes on Sunday, Keir Starmer played a blinder when he welcomed Zelensky a day early on Saturday after the Zelensky-Trump battle, and showed Zelensky that the UK was right behind him.
Prime Minister in prime ministerial shock. It's really quite something. Friday night. Wow. To be fair, I first started watching the footage on the Telegraph live stream at that throwaway remark that Donald Trump made as he greeted him at the steps of the White House, making this comment about his outfit and saying sarcastically, "Oh, you've dressed up for the occasion." And just something inside me bristled a bit. I thought, oh, that's a little bit uncharitable. Then obviously the scenes play out. And I literally don't think I could believe what I was seeing. You know, just very, very occasionally in one's journalistic career, you see something completely eye-popping and your internal monologue is, oh, I don't really think we should be seeing this.
Have you said thank you once? This entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you? You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III.
It was the idea of it all being played out in public like that. I felt deeply uncomfortable watching it. When people later referred, well, funny enough, I had my daughter with me because she was doing some work on her laptop and I was doing some work on my laptop. And she sort of turned around. She's only 11. And she went, what's happening here? And then said that she thought that Trump was, quotes, being a bully. And I thought, from the mouths of babes, an 11-year-old, she was like, they seem to be ganging up on him, mummy. Who's this guy in the black? I was like, oh, that's the president of Ukraine. So that was my overall perception. I found it very difficult to watch. And I did think that Trump and Vance were diminished by their behaviour. And that's not to say, because it was a whole 50-minute meeting, wasn't it? And we sort of, what's been replayed now are the kind of like the highlights, if you can call it that, the lowlights, I don't know what we called it. It was an extensive meeting and there was quite a lot of to and fro. And I can show some sympathy with America's side in thinking that this isn't their battle to be had and that they've ploughed billions into it and they can't see an end. And I think we can all support this idea that they just want peace in Ukraine. But the way in which it was handled was completely unedifying and not something we should have ever seen played out on the public stage, not least because Zelensky is a wartime leader who has had to endure 3 years of bloodshed at the hands of Vladimir Putin, and it was an illegal invasion. I think he deserved a lot more respect than he was shown. And it also betrayed to me a complete lack of understanding, frankly, of this conflict and what it means, not just for Ukrainians, but for the British and for the rest of Europe. It made me think, you're just so disconnected from this. This is so isolationist.
I think it showed us immediately a much broader picture of who Trump is. The day before, we'd seen him with Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer decided to play the supplicant. I think that was actually the only way he could play that meeting in the Oval Office. He made sure that Trump did almost all of the speaking. He hardly ever made any points that contradicted what the president was saying. A few days before that, Macron was a little sharper, but nevertheless was still very much, you're A, I'm B, I'm playing the kind of foil to your brilliance, and they made that clear. Zelensky, a very different character, not only a war leader, but don't forget, that Oval Office meeting would be being relayed live to Ukraine. Ukrainians would be watching their wartime leader, so he couldn't play the same game as Keir Starmer and Macron because he is leading people in a war that for Ukrainians is against a hated dictator, Vladimir Putin, who is killing their people. So Zelensky always would have to approach that in a different way. And I think those critics who have said of Zelensky, oh, you should have played it differently, you shouldn't have shown the pictures of the emaciated Ukrainian soldiers that had been captured by Russia and how they were being treated as prisoners of war. He had to show that he was standing up to a degree to the person who had described him as a dictator and the man that Ukrainians fear is going to sell them down the river. Inside the newsroom, Camilla, I was here, we were working on various things. Inside the newsroom, you know when those moments are happening. We have a hub in the middle, which is where all the main editors sit. And for big moments like this, they go on the main TV screen. So it was being sort of broadcast live in the newsroom. And slowly, the area in the middle of the newsroom grew and grew in number as all the foreign team came over, all the podcasts or all that audio team came over, features, news. We were all just watching it in sort of slack-jawed amazement that here were two presidents, one of whom was in a war situation, and the other president was attacking him in such in the way that we could see. Where does it leave us now is the question, and the central question I think of this podcast is, if Donald Trump wants to withdraw America from the security umbrella that it has always backed, what is Europe's role now? And Keir Starmer, and this is where he has risen in a way that so many people did not expect. I think those of us who've been sort of talking to Labour sources, straight after the election, a lot of the right of Labour said this is our chance to yank Starmer into the centre ground where he should always be. And I think since November, they have been slowly doing that, and the culmination of that was this weekend, where Starmer does appear to be, he was the one to make the call to Trump and Zelensky after that car crash Oval Office meeting between the two of them. He was the one to get Zelensky here on the Saturday. He was the one to then get the European leaders plus Mark Rutte, the Director General of NATO, on the Sunday. He's leading some of that debate. The big problem, Camilla, is can the European Union and the UK and other countries on the European continent really take charge of their own security?
Even French President Emmanuel Macron has said that it's for Starmer to be the linchpin in all this. It's for Starmer to be the conduit between the European nations and the US now, which puts the Prime Minister in such a strange position. The topsy-turvy world of politics has never been more obvious than in this entire scene. I agree with you, particularly his right-hand man, Morgan McSweeney, is dragging Keir Starmer not just to centre ground, but kind of the right of Labour. I totally agree with that. It is a departure. We talked about him being a political shapeshifter last week. This is the man who literally produced a 2020 leadership bid that looked like a Ken Loach movie. The departure of Annalisa Dodds reminded us last week that this was the woman, a Corbynite, who initially Starmer wanted to be his Chancellor.
The International Development Secretary,
exactly,
yes,
and
who
she's
resigned
now stepped
over
out.
the cuts in international aid.
Talk about topsy-turvyism. We now have a Labour Prime Minister being hawkish on defence, cutting the foreign aid budget, even though Keir Starmer opposed that. Now, there's another irony here, just from a Brexiteer point of view, that we have Keir Starmer, the man who railed against the referendum result, who repeatedly said, if we do this in the campaign, part of Project Fear was very much, we will not have a seat at the table. If it comes to defending European interests, we'll be shut out. Oh, hang on a minute. We're now leading the summit on this. I appreciate it was prearranged and it's taken on a different meaning in the aftermath of what's happened on Thursday and Friday, but still. And then weirdly, he's been benefited by Brexit by being in this kind of quasi-European role. The US and Trump is looking upon the UK more favourably on the tariff issue because we are now no longer a member of the EU. So isn't that a little bit ironic and back to front, but there you have it. And to be fair, I think we do need to give the Prime Minister credit for handling this very well. Maybe, I don't think, by the way, that Alistair Heath is wrong when he says that a lot of Labour policies are leading us to perhaps a socialist hellscape. But on foreign affairs, I was reflecting on it at the weekend, and I thought that criticism that we constantly make of him, lacking charisma, not really, being somebody who is out of the gates with kind of personality-driven politics, has served him so well this weekend, because he hasn't done the knee-jerk tweet thing. He's kind of considered, he's bland. He's not, everybody else is shooting their mouths off in response to the Oval Office. He holds his counsel, and then he's perfectly placed to kind of be the grey man at the centre of all this.
Trump doesn't want another showman. Our listeners, Camilla, immediately responded to the events of Friday night. Sarah Sillam, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Sarah. You've written in before, but you wrote to us only a few minutes after the Oval Office battle had ended, and you said, "Hello, Camilla and Kamal. I think you should bring in a psychiatrist to calm down all the righty Daily Tea listeners, myself included, who, quite literally, sprayed mouthfuls of MAGA Kool-Aid across their living rooms tonight. I lived in Russia for 4 years and woke up in Moscow the morning Putin invaded Crimea. Yes, Trump, it was 2014. Horrified, I waited for the world to take a firm stand against this violation of a sovereign state. Instead, history has recorded what happened next: a trickle of sanctions, half-hearted condemnations, and a reluctance to sacrifice comfort for principle. Europe had too many eggs in one Russian basket, and Obama lacked the geopolitical skill and backbone to act decisively." I think Sarah there makes a really key point that the failure of the European Union over Ukraine and Russia has been years and years in the making. In the 1990s, a solemn pledge was made to Ukraine. You will not be allowed to have nuclear weapons, but Europe will stand beside you if there is any incursion by Russia. There was an incursion by Russia in 2014, 10 years after that 1994 non-proliferation deal for Ukraine. And that incursion, it was the EU who were weakest in sanctions. And as William Hague said to us, former Foreign Secretary, he said that the UK tried to push them further, but they weren't going to allow that to happen because they had too much of a stake in particularly Russian energy. They needed Russian energy to be supplied to them. And the EU, at the moment of peak threat, they did not come together in a way that showed Putin that they were serious.
Francis Dearnley, our Telegraph colleague, who is one of the main presenters of Ukraine the Latest, which, by the way, is well worth listening to, not just today, but over the weekend, because they filmed an emergency podcast on Friday night, which was absolutely compelling. Their reaction to the events in the Oval Office was brilliant. That's Francis and Dom Nichols. So do please listen to our sister podcast, because Francis was at this extraordinary, very intimate press conference held at Stansted Airport on Sunday night, one of very few journalists to be invited. The Telegraph was there, and he's going to tell Ukraine the Latest today all about it. Let's have a listen to the question that he asked the Ukrainian president.
Francis Dearnley, The Telegraph. Mr. President, Russia has annexed regions in Ukraine it does not fully control. Is there any chance that as part of a peace deal, any territory could be given to Moscow, which is currently in Ukrainian hands? And what is your message to your people in the occupied territories?
Any chances that we, by our own volition, would give something away? No chances. Chances that we will legally recognize, I believe there aren't any. And it's not just because we are what we are, and that's, of course, number one reason, but there's the law. And even if one country, such as Russia, breaks international law, it does not mean that others will take this well and support it. So everyone understands that Ukraine will not recognize these occupied territories as Russian. We've been through this before, and I remember this path that we've gone before. We need to proceed from the UN Charter. We need to proceed from the understanding of the international law of all the partners, and we need to proceed from the understanding that time will come and Ukraine will get its Ukrainian land back. We don't want anything that doesn't belong to us, but when you take something that doesn't belong to you, or when you buy something, or when you occupy something, or when you break the law, everything will come back to you. If you steal somebody's house, their land, their life, it will be taken from you. It's just a matter of time. So there's nothing to discuss here.
No chance under your own volition of giving any territory away, but I wonder, is there any peace deal you could sign which would see territory go to Moscow that is not under control? You said not under your own volition, but is there any chance? Could you sign that deal?
Then it would not be a peace agreement. That would be a forceful separation of our lands. This will be a coercion that will, which mean a huge risk of hostilities after a certain time. And I think that those countries that are around this war, that are supporting us, or perhaps that want to be intermediaries in this war, they understand that if the war is ended in an unfair way, then it will be a matter of time before people will try to get this justice.
When I was researching a piece that I wrote in reaction to the King accepting Zelenskyy's offer to meet him at Sandringham on Sunday, I was reminded that one of the most vocal people in Europe was the monarch about the 2014 Crimean invasion. Admittedly, he didn't want it to be heard, but he was overheard by reporters likening Vladimir Putin to Adolf Hitler and had very strong words about the so-called illegal invasion. Isn't that ironic now in light of everything that's happened, not least because Donald Trump is so emboldened by the idea that he has this very close link to royalty? We've obviously had question marks over the state visit. The state visit is going to take place. It would be absolutely ludicrous to rescind the invitation. And I note that Kemi Badenoch has now distanced herself from comments made by the likes of Alicia Kearns, who used to be the chairwoman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, saying, oh, we shouldn't be rolling out the red carpet. I mean, there is an argument to be said that we perhaps shouldn't be rolling out the red carpet unless there is a security guarantee from the US, but I'm not sure that will happen. The question now, following this summit, which has announced a kind of coalition of the willing, Europe plus, that the Europeans now take on America on this, is whether they can actually win this.
Well, the last time coalition of the willing was used by a British Prime Minister, it was Tony Blair about Iraq. And which were the countries which were least keen on military action in Iraq? It was France, but it was many other members of the European Union. There is going to be an issue about ability. And I think one country which hasn't been spoken of enough, and this is why it's Europe plus, not just Europe, is Turkey. So Recep Erdogan, the Turkish leader, that is a country that has some links with Putin and is certainly friendly to Ukraine and has a lot of military ability and is seen Erdogan is seen as one of those strong leaders that might be able to play a role. I think you're right. Keir Starmer plays the almost civil servant role. What more can we do for you? This is the position of Zelensky. This is the position of Trump. I'm going to explain it to each of you. Whereas Erdogan could have a role as someone that Trump and Putin and Zelensky could do business with because of Turkey's key position in that sphere, in that geography.
On that note, do you think that Peter Mandelson, the UK's ambassador to the US, is doing some heavy lifting? Is he the one making the kind of controversial suggestion on behalf of Keir Starmer?
I did wonder.
Because he's suggested that there's that the UK is interested, like France and others, in a ceasefire. And then Downing Street has distanced themselves from those comments.
More than that, wasn't it? So this is classic. I mean, as you know, Camilla, I was political editor through a lot of Blair's years. And Peter Mandelson, Jonathan Powell, who was Chief of Staff after Blair and is now National Security Advisor to Keir Starmer. There is a whiff. Now, I don't have any evidence yet for this. There is a whiff of the new Labour playbook. So, Peter Mandelson, the new ambassador to the US, goes on ABC last night and suggests not only the ceasefire, Camilla, but that Ukraine should agree it first.
My response is that we need a very radical reset, as you say in the caption behind you. And the reset has to consist of the United States and Ukraine getting back on the same page, and President Zelensky giving his unequivocal backing to the initiative that President Trump is taking to end the war and to bring a just and lasting peace to Ukraine. And the Europeans, George, too, they need to back the calls for a ceasefire. And by the way, I think that Ukraine should be the first to commit to a ceasefire and defy the Russians to follow.
And then, as you say, this morning, the government has to come out and say the government speaks for the government, not the not the UK ambassador in America.
He
and it
wouldn't
sounds
have
like
said
a slap
it without permission.
Yeah, and it sounds like a slap down. And did Peter Mandelson overspeak? Peter Mandelson rarely says anything, not only without a great deal of thought, but without speaking to the key players. The idea that Mandelson was just sort of freelancing and sort of just kicking stuff around as if he was on, as if he was on some kind of chat show is for the birds. So I think you're right that Mandelson is playing a role where he can fly some kites in a way that can be quite easily denied then by the government, and he can be sort of criticised and, oh, Peter just being Peter. But actually, I think there is something there, which is, can they get to a situation where, at least at this stage, the killing can stop? The big problem for Zelensky there, though, is their worry for the Ukrainian forces is that any ceasefire gives an advantage to Russia, which can then pause, reset, and attack again. All Putin will use a ceasefire for is to re-energize the supply lines and have a better chance against Ukraine.
Kemi Badenoch could be playing this better, by the way. OK, so we talked about topsy-turvyism. You mentioned Sarah's email to us. Let me just read you two different Telegraph responses to this, which sums up the dilemma for the right. So we have Jeremy Newbegin saying, Trump was absolutely right to challenge Zelensky, who clearly wants the war to continue, funded by others. It's quite simple, people. What do you want, war or peace? But then we have P.L. Watson saying, a circus with Zelensky thrown to the lions. Appalling. Why aren't you wearing a suit? Why don't you say thank you? The man and his country have been going through unprovoked hell for 3 years. This was done on purpose to humiliate him, but what was gained? So what we have now is sort of Starmer righties and Trump righties. Kemi Badenoch should be speaking to the Starmer righties if Starmer is indeed trying to position himself more centrist to gobble up Tory votes, potentially, right? We've then got Nigel Farage, who is with Trump. We know he's with Trump because he's besties with Trump. He's campaigned on the basis of this close special relationship that he individually has with America. And we know that a lot of reform supporters are sympathetic with the view that Zelensky is a warmonger and it all needs to stop. And we know, actually, because we saw that polling, didn't we, that reform voters are more sympathetic with Putin in general than the rest of the general population. So Farage has gone on LBC today, did a phone-in and basically said, Zelensky has to cut a deal, otherwise there will be annihilation.
I think President Zelensky was very unwise to tell the Americans what would happen to them if they didn't back him. I think it was unwise. Yeah, sure, Vance and Trump bit back. But I think in diplomatic terms, I think Zelensky played it very badly. And it's very interesting that even Peter Mandelson, the British ambassador, is making very, very similar points.
Well, he's suggesting Zelensky should return to Washington.
He will. And he will. Mandelson is right. And he will. I think what came out of Friday...
You don't see anything intemperate in Trump's language at all?
Whether there was or whether there wasn't, we're heading towards peace. We're heading towards peace. It's a good thing, not a bad thing.
Would you treat a guest like that?
I wouldn't expect a guest to be rude to me in my own house. Absolutely not. I would expect a guest to treat me with respect. It doesn't mean that, for a minute that Vance and Trump, I'm not defending what they did.
So you are critical of what they did, Mr. Farage?
do we want peace?
Of course we want
or should
peace,
we spend weeks talking about what happened?
You did say you wouldn't defend what they did, so you wouldn't behave in that fashion.
I try not to. I try
what does
not
that mean?
to.
So you might.
Nick, this is irrelevant. This is where we all go wrong. We're all focusing on the row that happened. Maybe the row was bound to happen anyway. Zelensky wasn't ready, maybe for this, and perhaps the Americans weren't ready for it either. I don't know.
Is it right a journalist asked him why he's not wearing a suit?
Well, do you know what? If I turned up at the White House, I'd make sure I was wearing a suit and my shoes were cleaned.
But Badenoch, I don't think, is hammering home enough the more patriotic view of righties, which is, look, there's some things that I agree with Trump on. I agree with him on DEI. I agree with him on European defence spending. I agree with him on transgender issues. But on this one, I'm with Zelensky.
Actually, Camilla, there is a slight change of tone from the Conservatives, who, as you say, I think have been careful about how they deal with Nigel Farage and Putin. Priti Patel has just tweeted this. She says, Nigel Farage is completely wrong. President Zelensky is a hero who has stood up to Putin's aggression and led his country's defence against their barbaric and illegal invasion over the last 3 years. And it's troubling to not hear the leader of reform say that. For Nigel Farage to sit there pointing the finger at Zelensky is both morally wrong and diplomatically counterproductive. And here I think, Camilla, is the kicker. Sadly, it is not surprising, like Jeremy Corbyn, ouch, the leader of Reform UK seems to have history equivocating over Russia's illegal war on Ukraine. So that's the shadow foreign secretary coming out, taking the gloves off against Nigel Farage. But your sense is that it actually should be the leader, Kemi Badenoch, who's doing some of this heavy lifting.
Yeah, no, this is the trouble, right? She's been advised to just not mention Nigel Farage. And to be fair, they were kind of squeezed out at the weekend reform. I did interview Richard Tice. They weren't invited onto Laura Kuenssberg. It was just the Prime Minister, Kemi Badenoch and Ed Davey. So they're a bit marginalised. But the point is, there is a contradiction at the heart of reform. On one hand, trying to behave as if it's the party of true Churchillians and Thatcherites. Well, we know how those two leaders would have handled this, and they wouldn't be handling it as Nigel Farage is right now, would they?
No, Churchill was an absolute Atlanticist. He knew that Europe's security absolutely relied on America being fully connected into the European security map. It was Labour, and then obviously Churchill after that with his election in the 1950s, who built and supported NATO, that the UK would have a nuclear deterrent, but it wouldn't be fully independent from the US. A different route was taken by France under President de Gaulle, who was much more France only. France is independent. So Farage is in the anti-Churchill camp, and I think for a lot of, you're right on the margins, but I think even for reform voters, there's a question of patriotism here, that, you know, we're a country that can still remember in living memory being at war, and that means something to the UK's psyche and the British psyche in its approach to Europe and the dictatorship that is Putin. And I think Nigel Farage, as he is doing actually, because he has been supportive of Ukraine possibly having a route into NATO, which Trump has said is never going to happen, according to him. But Farage does need to be careful, because we know from the evidence that it's the Putin flank that is a weak flank for him. And during the general election, it was when he spoke about Putin that people responded negatively to it. And the big problem for those who support Nigel Farage, who support reform, who support Donald Trump, is this very toxic relationship with the dictator that is Vladimir Putin.